Welcome to the 2023-2024 STAAR Test Administrator Training, which is required for anyone who will be involved in the STAAR testing administrations for this school year. This training does not take the place of reading the STAAR Test Administrator Manual and becoming familiar with campus-based testing procedures. Campus test administrators are responsible for carrying out test administrations in accordance with all the policies and procedures shared during training. Please be sure you have signed in for today's training and have picked up a copy of the security oath. As you're filling your oath out, you will initial each box, not just check them off, and be sure you return your oath before you leave today. Please become 100% familiar with all campus-based testing procedures, and please ask any questions you have. The agenda for this training include testing updates, testing schedules for this year, assessments for special populations, test security, and basic test administrator procedures. Let's take a quick look at what's new in assessment this year. The STAAR test continues to be 100% online. Students must meet specific criteria for paper testing. The new technology-enhanced items, which we call STAAR 2.0, are continuing after they began last year. We'll continue to use the texasassessment.gov website and the testing service Cambium this year. For test session time limits, STAAR EOCs are limited to a total of 7 hours in one day. Students are expected to complete STAAR tests in about 3 hours. However, any student who needs additional time may continue testing until the end of the school day, not to exceed a total testing time of 7 hours. Testers who take longer than 3 hours will be consolidated into a second location. For STAAR Alternate 2, the assessment window is March 26th through April 26th of 2024. The preview window takes place 2 weeks before testing begins. The TELPAS and TELPAS alternate windows are February 19th through March 29th of 2024. On the screen are the spring 2024 STAAR testing dates for Alarcón and Borrego. Take a moment and review the dates for each test. On the screen are the spring 2024 STAAR testing dates for GEMS. Please take a moment and review each test and the testing date. It's important that every one of our students gets a chance to practice with STAAR online practice tests prior to taking the actual tests. By taking practice tests, students will become familiar with the online testing environment, available tools, and varying types of test questions. It's best for a student to sign in with their actual credentials, as the test will then open up with any attributes they might qualify for, such as text-to-speech or content and language supports. The practice and release tests that are available now do include the 2022 STAAR release tests, as well as TELPAS reading and writing practice sets. When a student logs into texasassessment.gov and then clicks Practice and Release Tests, they'll see 2 options to log in. On the left side, they can log in as a guest user, and on the right side, the student can log in with their actual credentials to include their first name and their TSDS ID number. By signing in with their actual credentials, the student will have access to any attributes that they qualify for, whereas those attributes will not show up if a student takes a practice test as a guest. This is a new feature for 23-24 in the test delivery system, which is where students take their end-of-course exams. Color choice has moved to inside the student interface. Students can control the color that they see while taking the test without having to pause and log out as they did before. Another enhancement to the test delivery system for students involves text-to-speech. Text-to-speech, which is the same as oral administration, involves the system reading any part of the test or the entire test aloud to each student as their needs dictate. In the system, text-to-speech looks like a mouth icon with sound waves coming out. That's what you see outlined in red on the screen. This year, pre-test instruction pages can now be read to students who have text-to-speech. Another test delivery system enhancement has to do with student inactivity. If a student is inactive in the system for 5 minutes or longer, a warning message will appear on the screen that says, "Are you still there? Click OK or you will be logged out." If the student doesn't respond to that message, the student will be logged out after 20 minutes and will have to log back in with their test ticket information. That completes testing updates. Our next section, we will look at accessibility for special populations. The two categories of accessibility that we'll look at include accessibility features and designated supports. What does accessibility look like in assessments? Accessibility features are available for any student that needs them. Designated supports are available only to students who meet specific eligibility criteria. Accessibility features can be used by any student who needs them. These include translating test administration directions, a bilingual dictionary, reading the test aloud to oneself, reading aloud the expository or persuasive writing prompt, using scratch paper, color overlays, or color settings, blank place markers or online guideline tools, sticky notes tool, magnifying devices, highlighters, tools to minimize distractions, individual or small group administrations, reminders to stay on task, and use of amplification or projection devices. Designated supports are available to students who qualify by meeting eligibility criteria. These include basic transcribing, calculation aids, content and language supports, supplemental aids, large print, manipulating test materials, mathematics manipulatives, text-to-speech, speech-to-text, or spelling assistance. Some designated supports have to be set up in the online testing system and will be ready for you as those students who need them log in. These include text-to-speech and content and language supports. Some students may need large print or speech-to-text. If so, these will also be ready for you when a student logs in. If there are other designated supports that a student qualifies for but don't need to be set up in the online system, you would be notified about these, and these would be ready for you in the testing room. Let's now turn our attention to test security. We're going to spend a few minutes going over some of the things that can happen during testing, which are called irregularities, in order to see how we can avoid these common mistakes from happening. The first type of irregularity is a category called procedural test irregularities. These are less severe, more common, and typically are the result of minor deviations from testing procedures. Types of procedural irregularities include accommodation errors, accounting errors, eligibility errors, monitoring errors, and training errors. We'll take a brief look at each of these. Here are some examples of accommodation errors, which are a type of procedural irregularity. A student was provided an unallowable accommodation that they did not qualify for. An allowable and approved accommodation was not provided to a student. An allowable or approved accommodation was not properly administered or applied to a student's test. Some examples of accounting errors include issuing students a test ticket that belonged to a different student, misplacing secure test materials, or leaving test materials open and visible for others to see. Some examples of eligibility errors include administering an incorrect test to a student. An eligible student was not administered a test he or she was supposed to take, or administering a test to a student when he or she is still in the first semester of that class. Monitoring errors are very common errors that test administrators can make. Examples include A test administrator left the room unmonitored during testing, did not monitor students during a break, reinforced test-taking strategies during the test, did not properly prepare the testing environment or device for testing, did not use the test administrator manual or read the SAY directions, did not complete the required seating chart. Or a test administrator did not actively monitor students and did not ensure that students worked independently, prevent students from using cell phones to take pictures, post, or send messages, verify that students recorded their responses online, and confirm that students submitted online tests. We just took a look at various categories of procedural irregularities which are more common. Now let's take a look at more serious violations of test security. These include directly or indirectly assisting students with responses to test questions, tampering with student responses, falsifying holistic ratings or student responses, viewing secure test content before, during, or after an administration, discussing or disclosing secure test content or student responses, scoring student tests either formally or informally, duplicating, recording, or electronically capturing confidential test content, and responding to secure test questions. More serious test security violations include failing to report to an appropriate authority that an individual has engaged in or is suspected of engaging in conduct described in the items listed above or in any other serious violation of security and confidentiality, failing to implement sufficient procedures to prevent student cheating, failing to implement sufficient procedures to prevent alteration of test documents by anyone other than the student. Serious violations also include fraudulently exempting or preventing a student from participating in the administration of a required state assessment, encouraging or assisting an individual to engage in the conduct described in the items listed above, or in any other serious violation of security and confidentiality. Penalties for serious test violations include referral to the State Board of Educators certification for potential sanctions, which might include a restriction, reprimand, suspension, or revocation of the teaching certificate with a minimum 1-year suspension, a Class C misdemeanor, invalidation of student test results, or lowering the accreditation or accountability rating statuses of the district. There is a minimum 1-year suspension of an educator's license when he or she is found to be at fault for committing a serious testing violation. Previously referred cases include a 1-year suspension for providing students direct and indirect assistance, a 2-year suspension for reviewing students' test responses, identifying incorrect answers, directing students to rework test items, and providing clues, a revocation for helping students solve problems and using voice inflection and facial expressions during an oral administration. It's crucial that irregularities of any type are immediately reported to your campus test coordinator. Here are some steps to follow. Clearly explain what happened, how it occurred, and how it was discovered. Clearly outline the sequence of events. List the date, room, the test administrators who were present, and the timeline of events. Include the information about how the problem was resolved or remedied, and include a plan of action to prevent the incident from recurring. All persons with knowledge of a suspected testing irregularity are required to report it to the CTC or the principal immediately. Regarding specific testing assignments and logistics for your campus test coordinator will share additional information on the testing schedule, logistics, and testing assignments shortly. The information that follows is only part of what may be necessary to conduct testing. Your administrators will share additional information as needed. Test administrators must ensure that the following required materials are available on the day of testing: a testing roster, a seating chart, cell phone oaths, student test tickets, a do not disturb door sign, scratch paper, pencils, and headsets for students who are receiving text-to-speech or speech-to-text test support when multiple students are in the room. To prepare the testing environment, no element in the room should hinder any student's performance. A testing do not disturb sign must be posted on all entrances into the room. All desks or computer workspaces should be cleared of books and other non-testing material. It is not necessary to conceal or remove instructional displays if they do not provide a direct source of answers for the subject being tested. Review rosters to see if any students require specific materials, and be sure that windows are not completely covered so that anyone who's monitoring testing may look into the classroom at any time. To prepare for students with accommodations, you'll receive a roster which will indicate what students are to receive accommodations in your testing room, if any. If a student in your testing room tells you that he or she normally has an accommodation that's not listed on your documentation, contact the CTC immediately. Before testing, ask your CTC to clarify your role in providing accommodations, if any. Any test administrator who has students receiving oral administration, which is text-to-speech, should verify that text-to-speech is active for each student that requires it. This will enable the little icon that looks like a face with sound waves coming out. That'll be visible on the screen as the student is testing. TTS, or text-to-speech, will be set up in the online test prior to the student beginning the test, and students can click on the TTS icon to have the system read items aloud as the student chooses for that to happen. Only the system should read items aloud. The test administrator should not be the one reading the items aloud. Any test administrator that is in a room with students requiring supplemental aids as an accommodation is required to review the additional supplemental aids presentation that your campus testing coordinator will send you prior to testing. Be sure to ask clarifying questions about supplemental aids prior to test day. For materials control, carefully inspect materials before you sign them out. You are responsible for all materials in your testing bin. Online test tickets are recorded on the STAAR materials control form and will be checked out and returned each day. The TA initials the out box, indicating that he or she is receiving materials as listed on the materials control form. The CTC initials the in box, indicating that the TA has returned all materials back after testing is complete for the day. Since testing is done online, you will receive test tickets. Test tickets are secure documents that will be checked in and out each day. On the screen is an example of what a test ticket looks like. There are several pieces of information on the test ticket that will be necessary for a student to sign in and access the online test. One thing that is not on the test ticket is called the session ID. The test administrator will write the session ID on the board or somewhere in the front of the room where it's easily visible. It is not located on the test ticket. You see an example on your screen with the first blue arrow of what the session ID looks like. It usually starts with the letters TX. When students log in to the online STAAR test, there are 3 pieces of information that they need that are located on their test ticket. If you look at the screen under Please Sign In, the student will need their first name, their TSDS ID number, and the session ID, which they do find from what the TA writes somewhere visible in the front of the room. If any mistakes happen where a student is unable to access a test, this is the first place to look. Did they spell their first name correctly? Did they get the TSDS number correct? And is the session ID exactly as written in the front of the room? If all 3 of these things are correct, we can continue to troubleshoot further should a student not be able to access the test. Once a student signs in with their test ticket information, they'll see a screen that says, "Is this you?" The student will then quickly verify that their information is correct on the screen to include their first and last name, TSDS ID, grade, date of birth, and the school. If everything on the screen is correct, they can then click the green yes to proceed to the next screen. Every test session will have a seating chart that needs to be properly filled out. Seating charts must include student full names, a diagram of where each student is sitting in the room, test administrator or room monitor names, start and stop times for testing, If students leave the room for restroom breaks, nurses' breaks, etc., you will need to record the start and stop time from when students left and returned to the room, the test date and the subject being tested, and the campus name and the room number. The directions that are to be read to the students are found in the Test Administrator Manual. Bolded words are meant to be read in their entirety. Directions in italics are what test administrators should be doing. Be sure to read the correct directions for the subject you are giving. Pay attention to the call-out boxes. Read the italics sections for information you need to know, and read the directions carefully. Test administrators must actively monitor the testing room at all times. Test administrators should confirm that students are only working on the subject area being administered that day and that they do not have access to non-allowable materials. It is permissible to encourage all students to stay on task. A trained test administrator must always be in the room with no more than 30 students. If a school emergency arises that represents an actual or potential danger to students, such as a fire alarm, students should go quietly outside and follow campus regulations for exiting the building. Students must remain seated during testing, and students are not allowed to talk to one another while testing is in progress. Active monitoring is walking around the room, being continually visible to the students, staying focused on what is happening in the testing room. Active monitoring is not doing your own work, reading, etc., sitting for the duration of testing, or being out of the sight of the students. In the event of a school-wide emergency that causes a disruption in testing, ensuring the safety of students and staff is the top priority. All testing materials should be left in the locked testing room if an emergency requires evacuation. In an emergency, testers should be closely monitored as much as possible. Always follow school safety policies and procedures during an emergency. About electronics on testing day, the test administrator must read the electronic use statement before any materials are distributed. Students nor TAs are not allowed to have cell phones, smartwatches, etc. on them during testing. All staff must also sign the cell phone oath each testing day. The TEA considers it a serious violation if a student photographs or duplicates secure test content or disseminates this information using any type of electronic device. TAs may not answer questions about test directions, procedures, or any questions related to the content of the test itself. If a student asks a question that you are not permitted to answer, you may respond, "I can't answer that for you, just do the best you can." Test administrators are not allowed to translate test questions and/or passages into another language. Test administrators cannot rephrase or add information to the questions or writing prompt. No person is allowed to view or discuss test questions with anyone before, during, or after testing. And test administrators cannot score test questions or discuss with students how they performed. It's important that online tests are submitted correctly. If a student has an illness or emergency during a test and cannot finish their test due to illness, they should not submit their test. The student should just log out of the test instead, and they'll be able to resume when they return from their illness. After submitting a test, once a student has submitted the test for scoring, the student will no longer be active in the test session and cannot access the test with his or her prior test ticket. If a student accidentally submits a test, please contact the CTC immediately. Before a student submits an online test, the TA must have the student call them over by raising their hand so the TA can verify the test is being properly submitted. Students will be consolidated to another area if they are testing longer than the scheduled time, but students are allowed to test until the school day ends. The TA may not look at or comment on answers to individual test questions or point out individually skipped test questions. The test administrator should mark the time in 1-hour intervals. This is not the stop time, it's the time before students are moved to a second location to continue testing. We can let students know that 7 hours of testing time is the maximum allowed. TAs can assist students with remaining on task if necessary. For student breaks, TAs should still note the time when students leave and return from bathroom breaks on the seating chart. If a student leaves for a nurse's visit, they should note the start and stop times when a student goes and comes back from the nurse. TAs may allow a stand and stretch break for the whole room and should note the times on the roster or seating chart. No talking would be allowed during the stand and stretch break, however. Students must click pause on their online test when taking a break, then click pause again to resume. If students are inactive for more than 20 minutes, he or she will be logged out. To resume testing, the student must log back in with the information on the test ticket. A student may pause testing if he or she is taking a break of less than 20 minutes. TAs should remind students that they should not click the Submit and End Test button until they have finished the test. After testing, ensure that all online tests have been completed. Account for all online test tickets, test booklets if any, rosters, scratch paper, seating charts, and any other testing materials or documentation. Collect all testing signs, materials, and supplies and place them back in the testing bin. Once students have submitted their tests, he or she can read or rest silently at their desk. Thank you for your attention during this training. Please make sure you direct all questions to your campus testing coordinator and be sure that you have returned your signed security oath prior to leaving the session today.